What we want to do today is talk about two different dimensions. We want to talk about story. We want to talk about value. And we want to ask ourselves the question, and again, I've used the word probably 4 times, wildly exciting. It's actually wildly exciting, right? This is where, right? Not so fast, Schwartz, right? This is where we gotta do it, okay? So what we're saying is that story and value are real. Now, we began the week with a citation from what we called uncontaminated material, right, which is a scholarly term, and particularly from Yuval Harari, right, in his book Homo Deus. But I want to just read you one sentence, and I tried to locate it this morning right on my phone so I'd be able to read it to you. So let me just give you actually the sentence, so you actually get the sentence and you can kind of feel it yourself, right? And you don't think that I made it up. So he tells the story, right, of the Crusades we talked about in the beginning of the week, right, of this kid in England, right, who's called, right, to the Third Crusade, actually, after Saladin, right, kind of sacks Jerusalem, and the Pope launches the Third Crusade, and he tells the story about this kid in England, right, who's called to the Third Crusade, and who's convinced, and we're all struggling a little bit on the last day, or the day before the last day, who's convinced that, he's going to go straight to heaven, right, the more Muslims that he slaughters. And Harari, partially appropriately and partially inappropriately, mocks that, right? It's appropriate to mock because it's a wrong belief, right? It's a bad story. But Harari's conclusion is that all stories, right, are actually just stories. And he writes at the end, after he tells the story about a kid, a few hundred years later, right, from the same part of England, who goes to help Muslims instead of kill Muslims, right, 600 years later, who's working for Amnesty International, and he says, and now we think that kid is working for human rights is great, but he says, and 100 years hence, our belief in human rights might look equally incomprehensible. Right? That's his giveaway line. Right? That actually, and that's his thread. That these are actually both stories. If there's a tissue someplace, I'll just steal it for a second. No tissues anyplace? If there just happens to be one, it's okay. And just for 10 seconds, I saw. No, guess tissues are in short supply. Right? Remember the supply chain issue here. Thank you so much. Thank you so much. I got it. As you open up a tissue and you're giving a class, you think about yourself, how can you blow your nose the quietest possible way? Because I'm like, how to do that exactly? So what Harari is saying is that this notion of the story and the value is actually, as we said earlier in the week, right, it's a figment of our imagination, it's a, quote, fiction, it's a social construction. In other words, universal human rights and the Crusades, both just stories, no intrinsic story and no intrinsic value, right? That is, a story that should be honored or a value that should be honored. And he plays, although he doesn't relate them directly, but he's talking both about story. These are both stories. These are both just stories, right? Kind of citing the basic postmodern move that suffuses all of culture, which is all grand narratives, right, are not true. Right? All grand narratives are just that. They're just stories, right? And all values are just stories, and there's no intrinsic place to hold, meaning there's no blessing of the Father. Did you get that? I mean, there's no blessing of the Father. The blessing of the Father is, right, that hand he's putting, right, on his shoulder, that's not true. And that's an illusion. And so that's what we want to look at. And I want to begin with the notion of story itself. And I want to put forth an idea which is a very subtle idea, but you'll get it clearly. And it took a long time to try and say this clearly, and I'm going to try and say it clearly to you, but it's subtle. It's not like there's certain ideas where like, wow, right? And there's others when you listen, like, oh. So I'm going to put an equation on the table on the overhead projector, okay, behind me. And the equation is story equals value equals eros. There's actually no distinction between them. Equals desire. And if I would do the equation in the right order, if you actually understand the words, which I hope we're going to do in the next few minutes, eros, right, equals, right, eros, I was being figurative, guys, but thank you. I was trying to imagine it behind me, but that was beautiful, thank you, right? Eros equals desire, which equals value, which equals story. There's actually no distinction between those words. It's a complete mistake to distinguish between them. We actually get they're all saying the same thing, right? Eros equals desire, right, equals, right, value equals story. We're going to work, that's our equation for the day, okay? Now, and they're all real. All four of those are ontologies, meaning they're all for realsies. There are surface versions of all of them, of course. There are pseudo versions of all of them. There are counterfeits of all of them. There's counterfeit versions of them. But if you identify them with their counterfeit, that's like saying sexuality is bad pornography. Not true. Bad pornography is bad pornography, right? Right? Sexuality is sexuality, right? So the equation, again, to have it down, eros equals desire equals value equals story. Now, what we're going to basically show, and I want to invoke my friend Howard Bloom, who calls himself a materialist mystic, right? His public position is that he's a stone-cold atheist. That's his self-description, right? He's an atheist like I'm the Pope, right? But he refuses to use language. He grew up as a Jewish boy in Buffalo, New York, right, and kind of completely and appropriately rejected those trappings and kind of, in his early 20s, kind of took a self-styled kind of position as a stone-cold atheist. He's one of the most brilliant, right, scientists, peer-reviewed across journals, right, all over the place, right, and philosophers of science. Along the way, he was the most well-known publicist in America in music, and he was Michael Jackson's mentor. And he found Peter Gabriel, right, and so he has this wild story. He's a wild man, right, and he's written a whole bunch of books, and he was kind of a key figure, right, in discovering, right, key artists, right, of kind of the, 1980s, 90s, and he discovered people that no one, Joan Jett, right, kind of out of nowhere, right, where he would kind of see something, and then he would work, 18 hours a day for 4 years to create that vision of that creative spark that he saw, right, and he did that, and he was very, very close with Michael. That's a long story, that relationship. And so he's a very, very kind of iconic, category-shattering person who still self-describes as stone-cold atheist, but again, he's an atheist like I'm the Pope, right? He's an atheist, right? He rebels against, right, the caricatures of religion, and I'm trying to offer him new language and new ways in. He's a senior fellow at the center. And we talk often, and so in this set of ideas, we've talked a lot. So I want to just invoke him right in the room, okay? So the proposition that we're making, which I am not offering it as a tentative proposition, it's as sure to me as this is a podium, or that I'm standing that it's true, right? It's a given in Cosmos. It's just, you just have to see it. And once you see it, it's like, oh, you didn't even say anything interesting. That's self-evident. That's what real truth should be. It's not persuasive. It's like, oh, of course. So I'm going to go for an of course, and I'm going to go step at a time. So here's the of course. The of course is that story is not a human creation. Okay? And if we need to, we'll do this in part 1 today and part 2 tomorrow. So we'll be able to kind of hold our container a little bit, right, of time. Okay? That's for those of you who were worried that we're kind of getting started at 12:40 and we're kind of predicting, right, making kind of prediction bets with your bookend when we'd end. We can split this into two. So we'll be at just Relax and easy. Okay, it's only 10. We got a little time. Okay, so let's go. Here we go. So the idea of story doesn't emerge with human beings. The assumption in historiography is that language comes into being, right? Everyone got that? Language. And language, right, generates story. And in fact, language is understood, right, as, in some historians, it's what allows you to hunt better, so it gives you a survival advantage. And more perceptive historians, Harari included, by the way, right, language is story, right? And it's the capacity to tell story, which for Harari is, he says, is just fiction, right? Is this uniquely human capacity, right? So human beings create stories, and classical historians, and they're just stories. And if you look over the course of history, historians notice that those old stories that people were willing to die for are now considered ridiculous. Now we have new stories, we're going to consider those equally ridiculous. Right? Eventually, that's what we just read, right? And the quote I just offered was that exact quote, endorsed by Obama, by Gates, right, by Bezos, right, etc. Meaning completely endorsed by culture. I mean, this is at the very center of culture. Now, if that's true, again, there's no blessing of the Father. But it's actually not true. In other words, if you actually look at the structure of cosmos, you actually realize that reality is story all the way up and all the way down. And actually, the word story is not different than information. And by information, we don't mean bits and bytes. Those of you computer people. We don't mean the way Shannon, right, the founder of information theory, used the word information. He used information as bits and bytes. But as Howard correctly points out, Shannon got the math right, but the metaphor wrong. Get that sentence? The math of information theory was clearly right, but but it's the wrong word. Information actually doesn't mean bits and bytes. Information means reality is coded with information. So story is the same as information, and information, is the same as value. What information means is that there's a set of values at play that guide the action. And value is the same as meaning. And meaning means there's meaning structures, right, in which this move or that move creates something new, and that newness has its own field of meaning, its own field of self-understanding, its own field of how it operates. So I'll just give you an example, and I'll cite here, for a second from science writers, but I'll cite just, one quote, right? Just when we look at that moment in which three quarks that we talked about earlier in the week, remember? When three quarks come together in one configuration of intimacy, and the week should start to come together now, in one configuration of intimacy, three quarks become a neutron. In another configuration of intimacy, three quarks become a proton. And all of us, every single person here, is constituted by those quarks, as is all the rest of reality. Right? So those quarks are things. Things. And we pointed out earlier in the week, and language actually discloses reality. Wittgenstein wasn't wrong about that. Right? The Hebrew word for thing is D-A-V-A-R, davar. And davar means word. And word means logos. Right? Meaning. Right? The word is the logos. In the beginning there was the word. Right? John. Right? The logos. So what's incepted into reality after space, time, and speed are things, and things are davar, and davar is the word or the logos, meaning a thing scientifically is a code of value and meaning. That's actually what a thing is. A thing is a story of value. So, for example, citing here from Bloom, when you put three quarks together, you get something that will make someday the solidity of a hand, the substance of a brain, and the churning heart of the stars. Right? I mean, it's kind of shocking. We're talking about the structure of reality now. okay? When you put three quarks together, you get something that will someday make the solidity of a hand, the substance of a brain, and the churning heart of the stars. The three, meaning the quarks, entwine together so tightly that it's impossible to tell that they were ever three individual quarks at all, and yet, of course, they retain their quarkhood. Meaning intimacy equals, finish the sentence for me, shared identity in the context of otherness, right? And then he goes on, our science writer, and the result of these three quarks coming together is something so fantastical that this cosmos has never seen its like before. The three quarks have transformed into a proton. This is much stranger than the merely weird, right? This is much stranger than the merely weird. It should be impossible. It's the equivalent of laying out 3 apples on your dinner plate and getting a woolly mammoth. Right? You got the point. And 3 quark can't become a proton. Can't happen. What it means is, when 3 quarks become a proton, what it means is that as they come together in this new configuration of intimacy, and I'm describing me, I'm describing you, I'm describing the substance of reality here. When they come together, right, they come together and they disclose a new code of meaning and value. And you get why we got to go to basics here? We can't duck around this. Right? When 3 quarks come together to form a proton is something entirely novel. It's literally a new configuration of intimacy, which is a new story of value. Right? It's a new structure of information. Right? It's a new structure of meaning, and that proton has a new attention space. It has new capacities. It has purpose. It has, listen to this, direction, telos. Right? It has desires. Protons have desires. Right? And it turns out 380,000 years later that these protons and neutrons are yearning for each other. They literally have a kind of incessant desire. Right? So there's a value that they're looking for. Right? The protons, the 3 quarks didn't have that. But these protons have a new set of values. They have a new set of desires. And so the protons and the neutrons desire each other. And then there's a new configuration of intimacy. So the 3 quarks are moved by the strong force into becoming a proton. And then 380,000 years later, there's this new configuration of intimacy, this new wholeness, this new value, this new story of value, this new intimacy, which is called an atom. And so it goes. So it goes, right? Right? And if it was 10 in the morning now, I'd go through like 10 examples of this because it's fucking awesome. Right? But this is the structure of reality. Right? This is how reality works. Okay? Now, I said to Howard, I love your woolly mammoth example. And Howard says, you can tell he's not a classical science writer, but he is, and again, recognized as such. In NASA, he's kind of the unofficial behind-the-scenes, guru of the space program. Right? That's where he kind of hangs. And I said to Howard, we have to actually be able to, and I had shared with him a similar set of ideas, which is how we got into this conversation, 4 or 5 years ago. And literally just 2-3 months ago, I said, Howard, we've got to actually formulate this much more clearly, right? Because it's just too, he said, you can't formulate it more clearly. I said, I think we can. And so just literally, we have the recording of it, right? Suzette has the recording literally 7 weeks ago. And I made the following proposition to Howard, which he accepted, which was one of our most exciting conversations. And here's the proposition. Stories always have 4 core dimensions. You can actually look at the properties of story, right? And get something of the actual constituent structure of cosmos, which actually changes your relationship to cosmos. And Howard said at the end of conversation, he said, even I could only call that spirit. Right? So here's the 4 pieces. So every story has a threaded action. Meaning it's not just a series of coincidences that happen to next to each other. David Hume called that constant conjunction. Shit happening one after the other, but there's no intrinsic relationship between it, right? So no, there's actually a necessary connection. There's, if you will, a causality. You get what I mean by that word causality? It's one thing is causing another thing. So a story has a threaded action, which there's a causality, right? Or said differently, there's a telos. It's going somewhere, right? So there's a telos, that's one. Second dimension of story is that this telos implies value and desire, right? In other words, the story wants to accomplish something. It's looking for something, right? It goes for that value and not that value, right? It very clearly chooses a path of value, right? There's a set of values, which is why intimacy equals shared identity in the context of otherness, right? Times mutuality of recognition, mutuality of pathos, and mutuality of value. There's a shared value, right? That's what a story means. So if we're playing together in the story, there's a shared value, right? It's going somewhere, right? So, which means there's desire, right? Right? Desire means I want a value that I don't have. That's what desire means. Right? I'm alive with desire, right? And James intuitively, right, said and completely correctly yesterday, and I didn't share the second half, which is, right, my basic need is not only to be desired, which is actually how we wrote it up in the phenomenology, but to desire, right? Because if I don't desire, I'm actually alienated from the structure of reality. Do you get that? Desire is not this weird shit thing that's kind of messing up my kind of civic personality. Right? Desire is the structure of reality. If I don't desire, I'm alienated from the core structure of reality itself, which is what constitutes me, which means I'm in denial of self, which means I break down, I pathologize, which creates, right, a mental crisis all over the world. And depression as the fastest growing illness because I'm alienated from my own constitutive structure. I'm not desiring. So desire is at the very heart of matter, we said, because desire means I'm desiring a value. So the second dimension of story is there's desire for value that guides the story. So there's, we might call, there's coordination in the story because there are ordinating or guiding values that guide the story. Fair? 3, story also implies a dimension of freedom. Right? If there's no freedom in the story, then you're reading a tech manual. Do you get what I mean by that? Does everyone get that sentence, right? Now, there's no freedom in the story, that's not a story. You're reading a tech manual. Oh, Lego part this, Lego part that. That's not a story. We know the difference between the two. Reading a tech manual is not that exciting. It's just not exciting. Oh, let me read my tech manual. That's exciting, right? Right? No, and it's not a story. So freedom is the requirement for it to be a story. There has to be some dimension of freedom in the story. And both Richard Feynman, the physicist, Stuart Kauffman, right, the mathematical, physicist, cosmologist, have pointed out in enormously complex series of mathematical moves, which we're not going to review right now because you'd all shoot me, but it's actually quite interesting and important, and Stuart is doing really the mathematics. And, my dear new friend over the last year, Perry Marshall, is working very, very closely with Stuart on this mathematics issue. But basically, what they're pointing out is that there's a dimension of freedom all the way up and all the way down. Right? There's a proto-freedom. Now, freedom doesn't mean, should I place my full heart and attention in the middle of day 6, or should I kind of just glaze off and figure out, right? It's not that kind of freedom, right? It's a different kind of freedom. It's not should I be with this person or be with that person? Should I make this career choice? Should I do this to develop it's not that kind of freedom exactly. But actually, here's the thing. Stay really close. That kind of freedom is not what you think either. Right? That kind of freedom that you think is a rational choice of Homo economicus is itself a structure of allurement. Remember what we talked about earlier in the week? And that thing which we think is this classical rational choice is actually embedded in structures of allurement. Right? And when you actually strip away, you realize there's this dance between choice and choicelessness. And so you realize that freedom doesn't exactly mean what we thought it did. It means something slightly different. There's freedom, there's choice, but the choice is to be me, right? The choice is to fulfill, right, my deepest nature, my deepest identity, right? And I can veer off from that when I become alienated from my allurement, then my allurement calls me back. So there's this notion of choice that has to exist in story. That's 3. And 4, and the 4th element, right, is sometimes there and sometimes not. And we could spend, you can imagine, we could spend a day just on these 4 dimensions. But you get the fragrance of it, right? The 4th dimension is, right, that in most stories, but not all, and I'm going to skip that distinction for now, why that's true, but in most stories, there's a dimension of crisis. And in the action, there's a crisis that needs to be resolved. There's an issue. So we say crisis is an evolutionary driver, right? Crisis births action. And in number 4, last thing, and all crisis is at its core, right, a crisis of intimacy. So single cells can't figure out how to breathe, right? There's a crisis of intimacy between oxygen, the elements, and so single cells resolve that crisis over a long period of time by becoming multicellular structures. Prokaryotes become eukaryotes, right? Meaning they create a new configuration of intimacy, which has a new story of value. Okay, that's the hard stuff for today. Okay? But you get what that means? I mean, do you get what that means? Right? You're saying, like, why are you not doing an exercise with us? Why are you not telling us, like, a great story? Why are we not looking at, like, a bunch of really good clips? There's nothing more exciting than this, right? In other words, you actually get every story has 4 elements. We stopped just using a word, right? And Howard, right, did the science in all of this, right? Because I told him he's my science check person, right? Because, in other words, I read science well. He has better intuitions than I do in science. I can read it, explain it for 10 hours, but he feels it in a different way. Lots of the reasons because he's got the math, right, which makes a difference. And so he validated this, kind of across the board. We kind of agreed on this. That's wild. That means now that there's an evolution of story. Does that make sense? Story evolves. We might move from unconscious to conscious evolution. And conscious evolution might be a new relationship to story, which we'll talk about a little later. So there's clearly, big sentence, last big hard sentence, between the levels of evolution, there's clearly continuity and discontinuity, right? Continuity, continuous. So there's story all the way up and all the way down. And the story has value. Stories have value, and the value is what we desire. So let's look at our equation now. We're going to keep looking at what our equation is. Eros means there's desire. There's desire for value. And that's what a story is. Eros, right, equals desire, equals value, equals story. They're actually the same thing, right? So actually, right, when desire is at the heart of matter, desire means there's telos. Telos and eros come together. Telos and eros means we live in a telerotic universe. We live in a telerotic universe. It's a universe that's animated by telos and eros, right, all the way up and all the way down. It's animated by value. And you can't escape that. That's the nature of reality itself. Now, value, we'll talk about it, evolves. Story evolves. So there's continuity and there's discontinuity. What's discontinuity mean? So now let's get to part 2.